That night, the camera at the end of the 9th floor hallway began to turn, slowly, as though someone were turning it by hand. The lens drifted away from the door of room 908 and came to rest facing the wall. 3 seconds later, the ceiling lights went dark. The man who stepped inside was in no hurry at all. On the bed, Rosalind Halloran lay motionless, her eyes closed, her throat wrapped in a thick bandage. The doctors said her vocal cords had been damaged in the fall at the loading yard, that she might recover, that she might not, and that in the meantime she would not be able to make a sound. He reached up to the head of the bed, took hold of the nurse call cord, lifted it off the rail, and let it drop on the far side, a hand's width beyond her reach. Then he leaned down. "You can't write anymore," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost gentle. "You can't speak anymore. Tomorrow morning a courtroom is going to ask who speaks for you." His fingers touched her chin and lifted it. Not hard, just enough to turn her face toward him, the way a person straightens a photograph hanging crooked on a wall. "Look at me, Rosalind." She opened her eyes. But she did not look at his face. She looked down at the hand holding her chin, at the ring finger less than a hand's width from her eyes, at the silver ring stamped with an anchor that only 4 people in that family were permitted to wear, the ring worn smooth along one edge from all the years its owner had spent tapping it against a table, while he waited for his turn to speak. He let go, only for half a second, but in that half second, he knew what she had seen. "The answer is already in the file," he said, and the gentleness was gone from his voice. "It was there before you fell." Out in the hallway, a beam of white light swept across the glass panel in the door. Sloane Merrick was passing room 908 and glanced in, the way anyone does after 3 years of night shifts. Then she stopped. In the dim light, a man was bent over her patient's bed, his hand holding the old woman's chin. The coffee slipped from her fingers and struck the tile. She pounded on the door. Inside, he let go and straightened up. He did not startle. He did not turn to look for a way out. He simply adjusted the silk handkerchief in his breast pocket and walked out through the stairwell door at the far end of the hall, unhurried, like a man who had finished visiting a relative, and it was time to go home. All Sloane saw was his back disappearing behind the steel door. The lights came back on. She rushed into the room and reached for a pulse. The old woman's heart was running at twice its normal rate, but her eyes held no panic at all. Those eyes were fixed on the eye-tracking board beside the bed, the device they had installed for her the day before, the one that let her spell out letters simply by looking at them. The screen flickered one last time before the backup power died. Sloane bent down and read the line that had made it onto the display. "He filed the papers before I fell." Then the screen went black. Sloane looked up at the old woman, and there was only one question in her mind, one that had nothing at all to do with the man who had just walked away. "Filed what papers?" If you believe that a person who has lost their voice still deserves to be heard all the way to the last word, leave a like, share this story with someone you care about, drop us a comment, and subscribe to follow this journey with us. The meeting took place in a windowless room on the ground floor, where the smell of scorched coffee from a pot, left heating too long, had seeped into the walls. Gil Stauffer, the head of security, sat at the end of the table with his tablet angled so no one else could see the screen. Bettina Rourke, the hospital's deputy director, arrived a few minutes late and placed a thin file and a pen on the table, though she never once removed the cap during the entire meeting. Sloane was still wearing her night shift uniform. She hadn't gone home. She recounted everything in the exact order it had happened, her voice steady, without adding a single word for dramatic effect. When she finished, Gil turned the tablet around. "The 9th floor hallway camera," he said, "had been scheduled for routine maintenance that night. It was normal for the lens to be turned while a technician adjusted the viewing angle." Sloane asked which technician. Gil replied that the work had been assigned to an outside contractor, and outside contractors didn't always record the name of the person who had actually performed the work. "Do you have any footage from that night?" she asked. "No. During calibration, the system stopped saving footage to prevent corrupted files from being created." Sloane moved on to the access cards. She said that although no card was required to leave through the emergency exit, anyone entering the 9th floor still had to swipe one. Gil nodded, turned the screen again, and pointed to a short list. That night, after the night shift began, the system had recorded only the employees assigned to that shift. There hadn't been a single card swipe from outside. No visitors, no one coming up from another floor. Bettina spoke for the first time. She asked Sloane whether she had seen the man's face clearly. Sloane fell silent for a moment, then said no. The only light in the room had come from the monitor. She had seen his build, his coat, the hand gripping the patient's chin, and a silver ring on his ring finger. Bettina repeated the words, "A silver ring," the way people repeat a foreign phrase they've mispronounced. "You recognized a ring in the dark," she said, "but not a face." Sloane replied that she had been much closer to the hand than to the face, and that the human eye was drawn to whatever was moving. Bettina wrote one short line in the file. Then she turned to the cup. Sloane explained that the coffee cup had fallen and shattered directly outside room 908, with pieces flying as far as the middle of the hallway. Gil opened another file. The morning cleaning staff had stated that there had been nothing unusual on the 9th floor that morning. No broken pieces, no coffee stains, nothing to clean except the usual trash. Sloane asked who had cleaned it up, then. No one answered that question. Bettina asked how long she had been working the night shift. 3 years, Sloane replied. Then Bettina asked how many consecutive shifts she had worked during the previous week. Sloane gave her the true number. Bettina nodded slowly, as though that number had just explained everything, then closed the file. She said the hospital had fully documented Sloane's statement that security would review the camera maintenance procedures, and that in the meantime it would be best not to mention the matter to the patient's family, because they were going through a sensitive period, and a rumor could cause damage no one could afford to bear. Sloane asked who would be harmed. Bettina stood, picked up the pen she had never uncapped, and said everyone. Out in the hallway, Sloane stopped beside the vending machine and stood there for a long while. She thought about the way Bettina had asked how many shifts she had worked, not because she wanted to know how exhausted Sloane was, but because she wanted a ready-made line to fill an empty box. She thought about how she had just described a clear sequence of events, and all 3 people in that room had nodded, yet no one had turned on a recorder. No one had asked her to put her account in writing, and no one had asked for the name of the patient in room 908 so an incident report could be opened. She had been in a room like that before, many years ago, in another city, and she remembered very clearly how it had ended. She took out her phone, opened the notes application, and began typing every detail before memory had time to soften them. The time, the position of the cup, the color of the silk handkerchief, the worn edge of the ring. Then she took the stairs to the 9th floor, pushed open the door to room 908, and found the old woman already awake and waiting, her gaze fixed straight ahead on the eye-tracking display whose power had been restored that morning. By mid-morning, the atmosphere on the 9th floor had changed. Sloane sensed it before she even saw anyone, simply from the way people moved. The medication carts rolled more slowly. 2 nurses talking at the station suddenly stopped in the middle of a sentence. At opposite ends of the hallway stood 2 men in dark suits, neither wearing a visitor's badge, neither leaning against the wall or looking at a phone. They simply stood there with their hands at their sides, their eyes sweeping the corridor in a steady rhythm. No one asked who they were. In the shift handover log, the space for the name of the patient in room 908 had been left blank and replaced with a code number. Sloane asked D. Whitaker why. D., the night shift charge nurse, who had worked in that building longer than the elevators had, said only that some names became a problem the moment they were written down, and she had seen it happen several times in her life. Raphael Halloran stepped out of the elevator shortly before noon. He wasn't taller than most of the people in the hallway, but there was something in the rhythm of his stride that made people move aside before they even realized they were doing it. His black wool coat fit him perfectly. He wore no watch, no chain, only a silver ring engraved with an anchor on his little finger. He walked straight to room 908, stood in the doorway looking at his mother for a long while without stepping inside, then turned back to the nurse's station and asked who was in charge. Sloane said she was. He told her he wanted his mother transferred to the private care wing in the east building, to a single room with a separate entrance, and that a car was already waiting downstairs in the lobby. He didn't say it as though it were a request. Sloane asked whether he had spoken with the attending physician. He said the doctor would be informed. She set the chart down on the counter, opened it, and said the patient wasn't stable enough to be moved, that her airway was still swollen, that any transfer would require continuous monitoring and at least one more evaluation before she left the floor, and that Sloane wouldn't sign the transfer papers in her current condition. The hallway went utterly still. One of the 2 men in suits turned his head and looked over. Raphael said nothing for several seconds. He studied her the way someone studies a number that doesn't match the balance sheet, not angrily, simply recalculating. Then he asked her name. Sloane Merrick, she replied. He asked how long she had worked there. She said 3 years, on the night shift. He said his mother wasn't safe on that floor. Sloane told him that if that was true, then what they needed to discuss wasn't moving her, but why the floor was unsafe, and that she had reported what happened that morning, yet no one had opened an incident report. This time Raphael remained silent longer. He lifted a hand and turned the ring on his little finger once, a small gesture he probably wasn't even aware of, then said he would wait for the attending physician's opinion. He had taken 3 steps away when he stopped and asked one more question, his voice entirely different now. Had anyone entered his mother's room the night before? Before Sloane could answer, the elevator opened again. The man who stepped out was in his 50s, with snow-white hair combed smoothly back, tortoiseshell glasses, a gray coat, and a silk handkerchief folded neatly in his breast pocket. He approached with both arms already spread wide, embraced Raphael, and struck him firmly on the back. When he drew away, his eyes were red. He asked how his sister-in-law was doing, his voice breaking on the final word. He said he hadn't slept all night. He said he should have come sooner. He said that if Raphael needed anything, he should call him at any time, at any hour, and that there were so few of them left in the family now. The 2 nurses at the station exchanged touched, sympathetic glances. Someone behind them murmured softly that it was such a shame. Raphael placed one hand on the man's shoulder, and while the silver-haired man's hand was still gripping his nephew's arm, light from the hallway window slid across it, touched his ring finger, and flashed against a silver ring engraved with an anchor, one edge worn smooth. Sloane stood in the doorway of room 908, her hand still resting on the doorknob, unable to move. In the room behind her, the eye-tracking device gave a soft chime to signal that a letter had just been selected. The Dockworkers Union headquarters stood at the end of a steep street that ran straight down toward the water. A brick building of 2 stories with tall windows and ceilings darkened by the smoke of several dozen winters. The meeting room upstairs contained nothing but one long table, 12 unpadded wooden chairs, and an enlarged map of the harbor hanging on the wall, its lines drawn in marker having been erased and redrawn so many times that the paper had worn white. Raphael arrived last and took the chair closest to the door, not the one at the head of the table. He removed his coat, draped it over the back of the chair, and placed a cup of coffee in front of him that he didn't touch throughout the meeting. Deacon Rowe stood leaning against the doorframe behind him, his arms folded across his chest. The meeting was halfway through when Bertrand Gauthier spoke. He was past 60, broad-shouldered and booming-voiced, a man who had controlled 3 refrigerated freight routes along the northern docks since the days when Raphael's father still sat in that room. He said the current division of routes had been drawn up by a man who had been in the ground for many years, that the market had changed, and that his men were carrying the heaviest burden while receiving the thinnest share. He said he respected the Halloran family, but respect wasn't an expense that could be entered in a ledger. His voice grew louder with every sentence, and by the time he finished, everyone around the table was staring down at the wood. Raphael let him say everything he had come to say. He didn't interrupt him once. Only when Bertrand sat down and reached for his glass of water did Raphael slip a hand into the inside pocket of his coat and take out a small notebook. There was nothing remarkable about it. Its faded moss-green cover was made of cloth, its spine was sewn with thread, its pages had yellowed to the color of cold tea, and a thin ribbon lay between them as a marker. Raphael set it on the table, opened it to the exact page marked by the ribbon, then turned the notebook around and gently slid it toward Bertrand. He didn't say a word. Bertrand looked down. The page was covered with handwriting no one in the room could read. Small, curved, perfectly even symbols arranged in rows like a low fence running from the top edge to the bottom, broken here and there by a few numbers and several slashes. For nearly 10 breaths, Bertrand didn't move. Then he raised one finger, touched a line near the middle of the page, and stopped there. The color changed in his face. It didn't redden the way it had when he was shouting. The blood slowly drained from it, beginning at both temples. He lifted his finger from the page, wiped his palm against his trouser leg without seeming to realize it, and stood. His chair scraped backward across the wooden floor with one long sound. He said he had misspoken, that he wasn't feeling well that evening, and that the matter of the freight routes could be discussed another day. Raphael closed the notebook, returned it to his inside pocket, and told him to go home and get some rest. Bertrand walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back once more and opened his mouth, as though he meant to say something to Raphael, but thought better of it and went down the stairs. His footsteps were heavy and uneven. Everyone at the table sat in silence. No one asked a question. One by one, they folded their papers, nodded farewell, and left earlier than planned. When only 2 men remained, Deacon stepped away from the doorframe, came to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat across from Raphael. He asked where the notebook had come from. Raphael looked at the harbor map on the wall for a while before answering. "It belonged to my mother," he said. Deacon asked what was written in it. Raphael said he couldn't read it, that no one had ever been able to read it, that it was a form of writing she had devised herself back when she worked at the courthouse, and that she had never taught it to anyone. Deacon asked how Raphael had known which page to open. Raphael replied that his mother had tied the ribbon to that exact page before entering the hospital, and had told him that if anyone in that room raised his voice, he should simply open the notebook and show that person the page. Deacon asked how many notebooks like that she still had. Raphael stood, put on his coat, and said 31. Then he switched off the meeting room lights and went down the stairs, leaving the cup of stone-cold coffee on the table. The following morning, Ellis Farrow came up from the biomedical equipment department to the 9th floor with a small cart and a plastic box filled with connecting cables. He was about 26, with untidy hair and an employee badge hanging crookedly from one side of his shirt, and he spoke to machines more often than he spoke to people. He reattached the eye-tracking device to its mount, adjusted the height of the screen, and began the calibration process. A small dot appeared on the screen and moved from one corner to another, and Rosalind had to follow it with her eyes until the machine confirmed that it could read the direction of her gaze. The first attempt failed. Ellis said the overhead light was reflecting off her lenses and causing interference, so he closed the curtains. The second attempt failed. He said she was blinking more often than the permitted threshold, perhaps because the medication had dried her eyes. The third attempt failed near the end, when the dot moved down to the lower right corner, and everyone in the room heard the machine sound an error alert. By then, 6 people had gathered around the bed. The attending physician stood at its foot, reading the imaging results, and telling the rehabilitation specialist that the damage to Rosalind's larynx might take several months to heal, perhaps longer, and that at her age, recovery was rarely as complete as people hoped. The rehabilitation specialist asked whether the patient was cooperating. The doctor said it was difficult to assess. Someone behind them remarked that the old woman seemed slower today than she had the day before. Bettina Rourke stopped by for roughly 2 minutes, stood in the doorway, and asked when the device would be ready to use. Then she told Gil Stauffer, who had accompanied her, that even if it couldn't be made to work, the record still needed to show that the patient had been provided with a means of assisted communication. Every one of those remarks was made less than 2 steps from the head of the bed. Not one of the 6 people looked Rosalind in the eyes. They spoke about her in the third person, right in front of her, the way people might discuss a machine waiting to be repaired. Sloane stood in the corner of the room, waiting for her turn to change the intravenous line, and she saw what no one else saw. Every time someone made a remark about how the old woman seemed today, Rosalind's hands tightened gently together on top of the blanket, then loosened again. After the entire team had left, Sloane pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, and lowered herself until her eyes were level with Rosalind's. She told her name. She said she would be on duty that night and the following night. She said she knew Rosalind had heard every word they had just spoken, and that she was sorry they had spoken that way. Then she asked if Rosalind wanted to try the machine again, not because the hospital needed something to enter into her medical record, but because Sloane wanted to know what she was thinking. Rosalind's eyes shifted toward the screen. Ellis began one final calibration, and this time, the dot completed its entire circuit. The machine gave a soft chime. Then the spelling process began. It was almost impossibly slow. Each letter required Rosalind to hold her gaze steady until a frame of light closed around its box. Sometimes she selected the wrong letter and had to go back and erase it. Sometimes she closed her eyes and rested for so long that Ellis assumed the machine had stopped working and moved to adjust it again. But Sloane raised a hand to stop him. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap, and waited. Beyond the window, the afternoon light changed from white to gold, and then to gray. At last, the complete message appeared on the screen. Check date. That was all. 2 words. Ellis read them aloud, then shrugged and said she might simply want to know the date, something that often happened to patients who had been confined to bed for a long time. He told her the day of the week and the date of the month, then asked whether she understood now. Rosalind didn't respond. She continued looking directly at Sloane. Ellis gathered up the connecting cables and left. Sloane remained seated for a while longer, and then she understood that those 2 words weren't a question. They were an instruction. When her shift ended, she didn't go home. She went down to the records department, requested a copy of the complete admission file for the patient in room 908 on the grounds that she needed it for the nursing handover, and sat reading in a corner of the staff lounge beneath the only light still burning. Near the back of the file, tucked between the billing documents and the intake report, she found a copy of an emergency guardianship petition that had been submitted to the court, stamped as received, and entered into the hospital system. The petitioner was Gideon Halloran. In the section describing the subject's condition, one sentence appeared in bold print, stating that the subject was no longer capable of speech. Sloane read that sentence 3 times. Then she looked at the upper right corner of the page, where the receipt stamp showed the date, and she sat there for a very long time without moving, because the date on that stamp came before the night Rosalind Halloran collapsed in the loading area. Sloane waited for Raphael in the 9th floor hallway early the following afternoon, the photocopied page folded in half inside the pocket of her scrub top. She had spent the entire night weighing whether she should give it to him, and in the end, what made her decide wasn't trust, but the simple calculation that there was no one else left in that building to give it to. He finished reading it faster than she had expected. Then he read it again, much more slowly. He didn't ask where she had gotten it. He only asked whether the original was still in the hospital system, and when she said it was, he folded the page along its original crease and made a phone call right there in the hallway. Warren Ashcroft arrived less than an hour later. He was in his 50s, wearing a sand-colored tweed coat and carrying a leather briefcase worn at the corners, and he didn't appear to be in any hurry. He greeted Sloane by name before anyone had a chance to introduce her, said he had read the record of the previous morning's meeting, and found her account clearer than most of the statements he had read in 20 years of practice. Then he sat down in a plastic chair in the waiting area, opened his laptop, and began working without another word for a long while. He looked up the case number on the court portal, cross-checked the petitioner's name, verified the witness's signature, and finally turned the screen toward Raphael. "The petition is real," he said. It had been accepted, assigned a case number, and was currently awaiting a hearing date. He went on to say that he wanted both of them to understand one thing clearly before they reacted, that this kind of petition required very little proof at the initial stage, only a description of the person's condition and the signature of a relative, and that precisely because it was so easy to file, it was often used as a way to seize time. Raphael asked whether Warren could have it withdrawn. Warren said he could file an objection that very afternoon, request that the court appoint an independent representative, and delay the proceedings long enough to investigate, but he couldn't make the petition cease to have ever existed. Then he stood, gathered his briefcase, said he would send a complete copy that evening, and warned Raphael not to sign anything anyone placed in front of him over the next several days, no matter who brought it. As he passed Sloane, he shook her hand and told her that if the hospital caused her any trouble, she should call him. After Warren left, Raphael went to the large window at the end of the hallway and stood with both hands braced against the sill, looking down at the parking lot below. He remained that way for a very long time. Sloane didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. At last, he spoke, his voice so low and ordinary that it sent a chill down her spine. He said there was one thing he couldn't understand. Someone could predict that a 63-year-old woman might fall. They could predict that she would break an arm, break a hip, perhaps end up in the hospital. But no one could predict that she would lose her voice. No one wrote those words on a document in advance, and then sat back and waited. He turned to Sloane and asked whether she understood what he meant. She said she did. They entered room 908 together. Raphael pulled a chair close to the bed, and for the first time since his mother had been admitted, he sat down instead of standing. He told her everything, leaving nothing out, including the date on the stamp. Rosalind listened to it all. Then her eyes shifted toward the screen. The spelling process was faster than it had been the day before, but still slow enough that the only sounds in the room were the breathing machine and the soft chime each time a letter was selected. The words appeared one piece at a time, not predicted. Then came a long pause. Ordered. Raphael read the message twice. Then he stood, reached for the coat draped over the back of the chair, and Sloane knew immediately where he intended to go, because his face wasn't angry. It had gone completely blank. The emptiness of a man whose decision had already been made, and who was merely waiting for his feet to finish what remained. He told his mother he would be back before morning. At the head of the bed, the little chime sounded again and again, more urgently than it ever had before. Raphael stopped in the doorway. He turned back toward the screen. "If you go," a pause, "you'll sign your name in his place." He stood there for a very long time with his coat in his hand, and Sloane watched his fingers tighten around the fabric, then slowly release it. Dee Whitaker was waiting for Sloane in the nurse's lounge at the end of her shift, and she didn't say anything at first. She simply placed a brown, hardcover notebook on the table, the kind sold at a grocery store counter for a few dollars. She said she didn't trust computers, not because she didn't know how to use them, but because she had lived long enough to see that anything stored in a computer could disappear from it, while anything she wrote by hand stayed exactly where it was until the day she died. She opened the notebook. Inside were brief entries, one incident to each line, written in the steady cursive of someone who had learned penmanship in a public school back when handwriting was still taught as a subject. She turned through several pages, stopped, and rotated the notebook toward Sloane. A name was written there, Walter Pruitt. Dee said she had entered that name in the notebook during the spring, and she had done it because one morning she overheard two people from social services saying that the old man on the 6th floor was so confused he couldn't even remember where he lived, when Dee herself, just the day before, had listened to him recite the names of every ferry that had ever served the Bay route in the exact order of the years they were launched. The following afternoon, Sloane received permission to take Walter down to the hospital garden. He was 79 and used a wheelchair not because he couldn't walk, but because he became short of breath over long distances, and he wore a dark blue wool sweater with patches at the elbows sewn on in thread of a different color. It was late autumn, the sunlight was pale, and the maple trees in the corner of the garden had turned completely red. He sat in silence for a while, then reached into his pocket and took out a brass stopwatch with a hinged cover, its glass face covered in scratches, the plating worn away where his thumb had rested against it over so many years. He turned it in his palm out of a habit he probably no longer realized he had. He said he had worked in the ferry terminal's engine shop for 31 years, that his job had been to keep time, and that a person could be late for anything in this world except the tide. Sloane asked whether he remembered the tide schedule. The old man looked up at her, and for one moment, his face changed completely. Then he began to recite it. He recited the tide schedule for the entire season, one day at a time, the high tides and the low tides, the difference between them, which days the water held still longer, and which days the northeast wind brought the tide in earlier than usual. He spoke without interruption, his voice even and certain, never stumbling, never faltering, never once pausing to remember. Sloane looked it up on her phone as he went. He didn't make a single mistake. When he finished, they both sat quietly. Then he closed the cover of the stopwatch and said, in a much softer voice, that he knew what they had written about him in his medical record. He said he had overheard it one day, right there in the hallway, and had spent the entire afternoon lying with his face turned toward the wall. He said it was a strange kind of word, because once people had placed it on you, the harder you tried to speak clearly, the more convinced they became that you were trying to hide something. He said he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of the day people stopped asking what he wanted done with his own boathouse. Sloane couldn't find anything to say. She simply placed her hand over the back of his, and he left it there beneath hers. That evening, she remained with Dee's notebook until nearly dawn. In addition to Walter Pruitt, there were two other names, an elderly woman named Corinne Ashby on the 4th floor, who had once taught music at a high school, and an elderly man named Otis Brennan, who had been discharged during the summer. All three files named the same company as the petitioner seeking guardianship, a company called Harrogate. All three descriptions of the patient's conditions used almost exactly the same wording, stating that the subject was disoriented, unable to express thoughts coherently, and uncooperative during evaluation. And when Sloane traced the inpatient appointment records of all three people backward, she found one final thing they had in common, the thing that made her put down her pen and sit upright in the deserted lounge. Before the day something happened to each of them, they had all been invited to the financial counseling office on the 2nd floor, where patients disclosed their homes, land, savings, and insurance policies in order to apply for assistance with their hospital bills. All three of them had written out lists of everything they owned in their own hands, and someone had read those lists. 3 days later, Sloane arrived for her shift and discovered that her employee badge wouldn't unlock the ward door. She swiped it twice more, then pressed the bell, and the person who opened the door was a security guard she had never seen before. He told her she had been instructed to report to Human Resources on the ground floor. Bettina Rourke was waiting inside with Gil Stauffer, a woman from compliance whom Sloane had never spoken to, and a file considerably thicker than the one from the previous day. Bettina came straight to the point. A routine inventory had revealed that controlled substances were missing from the medication cabinet on the 9th floor. The electronic access log showed that Sloane Merrick's login code had been used to open the cabinet twice, without any corresponding medication orders in the system. Both incidents had occurred during night shifts, and both had taken place within the previous week. Sloane asked whether there was a camera in the medication room. Gil said the medication room camera was part of a cluster of equipment awaiting replacement and hadn't recorded any footage during that period. Sloane asked whether anyone had seen her in the area at those times. The woman from compliance said that question mattered less than the fact that login codes were personal and weren't permitted to be shared, and that no matter who had performed the actual operation, responsibility still belonged to the owner of the code. Bettina pushed the decision across the table. Suspension pending an internal investigation. Revocation of access privileges. Referral of the case to the state licensing board. Sloane read the entire page, then looked up and asked only one question: whether any of this had something to do with her report concerning room 908. Bettina said the two matters were entirely separate, and that she hoped Sloane wouldn't try to link them, because doing so would only make people think she was attempting to divert attention. Sloane placed her employee badge on the table. She walked out to the parking lot and sat in her car for a very long time without starting the engine. There was something she hadn't thought about in years, and now it rose back into her mind, whole and untouched. Her brother, who was 19, had been lying in another hospital in another city. On the night he didn't survive, she had read his chart and found one line in the medication orders that didn't match. When she read it again 3 days later, that line had been changed. She reported it. They thanked her, they formed a review committee, and then, 6 months later, when she applied for a job somewhere else, she learned that people in the profession had given her a name of their own: difficult employee. It was a label that appeared in no official record, yet followed a person more stubbornly than any record ever could. It had taken her 2 years to find a place willing to hire her. That place was this hospital. Warren Ashcroft called that afternoon. He said he had just heard the news and found the situation deeply regrettable. He asked whether she intended to file an appeal with the licensing board. Sloane said she was looking for a lawyer. Warren fell silent for a moment, then said, in the considerate voice of someone who genuinely wanted the best for her, that he advised her not to do that just yet. He explained that once she filed an appeal, an official case would be opened. Everything she said would become part of the record, and the people on the other side would have the right to demand documents, including documents she was holding that shouldn't be revealed at this stage. He told her to sit tight for a few days, not to sign anything, not to send anything, and to let him handle it. He said he had ways of speaking to these people without requiring anyone to step forward publicly. Sloane thanked him and ended the call, and in that moment she felt relieved, because it had been a very long time since anyone had said those words to her. Near dusk, someone knocked on the door of her apartment. Raphael stood alone in the hallway, with no one accompanying him. He said he had just heard what happened. He said he had lawyers better than anyone she could find. He said he would pay every expense, and he said he would also cover the cost of her mother's care at the nursing home so she wouldn't have to worry about money during this time. He said all of it calmly, as though reading from a list. Sloane stood within the narrow doorway and asked how he knew her mother was in a nursing home. Raphael didn't answer. She asked again, more slowly. He said he needed to know who the people close to his mother were. Sloane nodded. She said he hadn't learned about her. He had assessed her value, and those two things were far more different than he seemed to understand. Then she closed the door and stood with her back against it in the darkness until she heard the elevator doors close at the end of the hallway. Marguerite Halloran received the message in the middle of the morning while she sat in her car waiting to pick up her daughter from music class. The sender was a string of numbers she didn't recognize. There were no words with it, only an audio file just under a minute long. She pressed play, and the voice that came through her phone speaker was her mother's. It wasn't her real voice. It was the flat electronic voice of the eye-tracking communication device, the voice the whole family had grown accustomed to over the past several weeks, without inflection or emotional pauses, every word standing apart from the next. The voice said that she had thought carefully, that she recognized her health no longer allowed her to continue making important decisions for herself, that she trusted the management of her affairs to her husband's younger brother, Gideon Halloran. and that she hoped her children would understand. Marguerite listened all the way through once, then sat perfectly still, her hands still resting on the steering wheel. Then she listened a second time. By noon, the entire family had gathered in room 908. Raphael stood at the foot of the bed. Marguerite sat in a chair with red eyes, placed her phone on the rolling bedside table, and played the recording again for her mother. Rosalind listened from beginning to end, without any change in her expression. When the audio file ended, Marguerite asked whether her mother had sent it, and her voice broke on the final word, not because she believed it, but because she was afraid that if she didn't ask, the question would remain inside her forever. Rosalind shifted her eyes toward the screen. The little chime sounded one note at a time, slowly, until the full message appeared. Play again. Listen to capitals. No one understood. Marguerite played it once more. Rosalind waited until the exact passage she wanted them to hear, then looked directly at Raphael. The second message appeared on the screen more slowly than the first. Mother's machine doesn't capitalize. Ellis Farrow was called upstairs. He opened the device settings, and everything became so clear that Marguerite had to raise a hand to cover her mouth. The functions that automatically capitalized the beginning of sentences and proper names had been turned off. Ellis said Rosalind herself had asked him to disable them on the day the calibration finally succeeded, because every time the device switched to capital letters, the keyboard layout on the screen had to change, and every change in layout cost her several extra beats of looking for each letter. For someone in her condition, he said, those few beats were a great deal. Then he ran the recording through comparison software and pointed out the difference. In the file sent to Marguerite's phone, proper names were spoken the way the device read capitalized words, with an extremely brief pause before each name, something Rosalind's device had no longer been capable of producing since the day she turned that function off. Someone had assembled the recording on another machine of the same type, with the same voice, but had left the default settings unchanged. Raphael stood in silence, staring at the screen for a long while, then said that whoever had created it had to know what kind of device Rosalind used. That afternoon, everything took a turn no one had expected. Ellis Farrow was detained by security on the ground floor as he stepped out of the elevator. On the laptop he carried, they found copies of the 9th floor hallway camera footage, system access logs, and a folder containing configuration records for assisted communication devices. Gil Stauffer said Ellis had copied hospital data without authorization. Bettina Rourke said this explained a great many things. By evening, a federal agent named Margot Tillett had arrived at the hospital, and Ellis was taken away. Before they led him through the doors, he turned toward the 9th floor hallway and told someone standing nearby that he had made backups because someone was deleting things, not because he wanted to take them. No one entered that statement into the official record. That night, when only Raphael and his mother remained in the room, he sat beside her bed and said that perhaps they had found the person they were looking for. Rosalind studied her son for a long time, then she looked toward the screen, and the little chime began sounding again, one note at a time, slow and steady, until 3 words appeared against the pale blue background, much too obvious. Raphael read them again. She typed another message, this one shorter. The real one erases everything. This one left evidence. Beyond the room, the white lights burned evenly above the row of closed doors, and at the far end of the hallway, the newly replaced camera pointed directly at the door to room 908, silent and obedient, as though nothing had ever happened. Margot Tillett returned the following morning alone and without warning. She was in her 40s, with short hair, a canvas jacket, and flat shoes like someone accustomed to standing for long stretches, and she spoke with the bluntness of a person who had long since abandoned the habit of softening her words. She asked to speak with Raphael privately in the waiting room at the end of the hallway, and once he sat down, she said she wanted to show him something before he heard about it from someone else. She took a stapled packet from her bag and placed it on the table. It was another petition for emergency guardianship. The same form, the same structure, the same statement that the subject was no longer capable of speech, the same request that the court appoint someone to make financial and medical decisions on the subject's behalf. There was only one difference. In the section naming the petitioner, instead of Gideon Halloran, it said Raphael Halloran, and below that, in the signature box, was his own signature. Raphael picked up the document. He stared at it for a very long time, and Margot let him look. Then he said he had never seen that paper before. Margot nodded as though she had expected him to say exactly that, then told him precisely where the problem lay. The petition had been filed through the electronic portal. It wasn't a scan of a handwritten signature. It had been signed digitally, and that digital signature was linked to Raphael Halloran's personal identity account, the one he had registered several years earlier to sign corporate documents. The signature had been executed from a device listed as trusted on that very account. There was no sign of a login from an unfamiliar location. No security alert. Nothing unusual in the system logs. Margot said that was why she had brought the document herself, instead of sending it through official channels. On paper, this wasn't forgery. On paper, this was a son petitioning to have his mother declared incapacitated 3 days before she fell. Raphael set the paper down. He asked whether she believed him. Margot said what she believed didn't matter. What mattered was that a judge would see 2 petitions containing the same claims, filed by 2 members of the same family. And the most obvious conclusion anyone would reach was that the entire family wanted control of the elderly woman's assets and was merely fighting over who would get it. She said that once such a conclusion had taken hold, everything Rosalind Halloran said afterward, whether through a machine or with her own voice, would be interpreted as noise in the middle of a family dispute. She gathered up the packet and said she would stay in touch. At the door, she stopped and added one more thing. Whoever had constructed this didn't need Raphael to confess. They only needed him to spend his time proving his innocence, because the time he lost doing that was exactly what they needed. Raphael remained there alone for a very long time. Then he went into room 908. He closed the door behind him, pulled a chair close to the bed, and laid a copy of the petition on the blanket in front of his mother. He didn't explain anything. He only said he wanted her to read it before someone else told her about it in their own way. Rosalind read slowly, her eyes moving across each line, and when she reached the signature box, she stopped much longer than she had anywhere else. Raphael sat silently, waiting for the question he knew would come, the question any mother would ask, and he had spent the entire morning preparing his answer. But she didn't ask it. Her eyes shifted toward the screen, and the little chime began to sound one note at a time. He waited. The message appeared slowly, one letter after another, and when it was complete, Raphael looked up at his mother, and for one moment, he stopped breathing. "Who still has your pen?" He read it a second time. Then he understood that his mother hadn't doubted him for even a single second, and that made it harder for him to breathe than the petition itself had. He took out his phone, opened the settings for his identity account, and began reviewing every line in the list of devices authorized to sign on his behalf. The list was longer than he remembered. He reached the 4th entry and stopped, and his finger didn't move again. The scan had been scheduled the day before. The hospital didn't have the right machine for this examination, so the patient in room 908 would be transported by ambulance to an imaging center on the west side of the city, undergo the scan, and return before the morning was over. Raphael read the paperwork carefully, asked for the name of the transport company, and decided to follow in his own car. Sloane was no longer permitted inside the hospital, but she still had access to the Patient Transport Coordination app, an account Human Resources had forgotten to revoke, and she sat at the kitchen table in her apartment with her laptop open, watching a small green dot crawl across the map. They wheeled the gurney out of the service elevator in the middle of the morning. Rosalind lay on her back with a safety strap across her chest, her eye-tracking communication device folded shut and secured to the frame beside the gurney. From that position, all she could see was the corridor ceiling drifting overhead, then the ceiling of the elevator, then the white sky for one brief moment as they pushed her across the courtyard, and then the ambulance ceiling with its 2 long rows of lights and a ventilation fan turning slowly. A paramedic sat in the seat beside her, checked her pulse, then lowered his eyes to his phone. The rear doors closed. The ambulance began to move. Rosalind counted by listening. She heard the wheels cross the bridge, expansion joints 3 times at even intervals. She heard a ship's horn echoing from the harbor, growing fainter. She heard the clicking of a turn signal and the rhythm of the ambulance slowing down. She couldn't see the road, but she had traveled through this city for nearly her entire life, and in her mind, the route to the imaging center on the west side had a very clear shape. When the ambulance should have turned left onto the avenue to reach the elevated roadway, it turned right. Rosalind felt her body tilt toward the left side of the vehicle. She waited. It didn't turn back. Instead of fading, the ship's horn began to grow louder. Then the sound of the road changed, from the soft hum of asphalt to the rhythmic seams of concrete. The sound of the older streets in the warehouse district. She turned her eyes as far forward as they would go, toward the gap between the 2 front seats, where she could see one corner of the dashboard and part of the driver's shoulder. She couldn't see his face, but she saw enough to know that he wasn't the driver who had signed for her at the hospital courtyard, because that man had been wearing a uniform with a reflective stripe across the shoulder, and this one wasn't. She shifted her eyes toward the eye-tracking device fastened beside the gurney. It was still folded shut. No one had opened it for her. She tried to lift her right hand, and it moved only a couple of inches before the safety strap held it back. The paramedic beside her was still looking down at his phone. Rosalind stared at him for a long time, willing him to look up, willing him to notice that his patient's eyes were wide open, willing him to look out the window. He didn't raise his head. Across the city, in her apartment, Sloane watched the green dot slide away from the gray route on the map. She opened the dispatch log and saw that the route had been updated at the moment the ambulance left the hospital grounds. The reason listed was a construction detour, and the change had been made by an administrator account with no name attached. She called Raphael. He said he was 2 intersections behind and had been caught at a red light where a line of trucks was turning toward the docks. She read him the name of the street the green dot had just passed. He went silent for several seconds, then said that street led nowhere except to a few abandoned parking lots behind the row of cold storage warehouses. Inside the ambulance, Rosalind heard the engine drop into a lower gear, then the tires grinding over gravel. The vehicle came to a complete stop. The engine shut off. In the sudden silence, she heard the wind striking the side of the ambulance and the cries of seagulls somewhere very close. The paramedic beside her finally looked up, glanced out the window, and his face changed. He asked the driver why they had stopped there. No one answered. The driver's door opened and closed. Footsteps came around toward the rear, slow and steady, grinding into the gravel. Rosalind lay still with her eyes fixed on the ambulance ceiling, and she clearly heard the rear door latch being pulled down. The door opened. Daylight flooded in, so blinding that she had to close her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, a figure stood there, black against the sky. The person stepped onto the ambulance's rear step and leaned down to look at her. Then a voice spoke, and it was a voice Rosalind Halloran hadn't heard in many years. The person standing at the rear doors of the ambulance was Margot Tillett. She held out her badge in front of the driver, who stood frozen beside the vehicle, called him by name, and told him she had been following the ambulance ever since it turned off the avenue. 2 more vehicles pulled up behind them, without sirens or flashing lights. The driver didn't resist. He only kept repeating that he had been called in as a last-minute replacement, that the route had already been loaded onto the device, and that he had simply followed the navigation system. The paramedic sitting inside the ambulance climbed out, his hands trembling so badly that he dropped his phone. Margot stepped onto the rear step, bent down, and the first thing she did was unfold the eye-tracking communication device secured beside the gurney, raise it into position, and turn it on. Then she told Rosalind that she would remain there until the elderly woman had written her first sentence. Raphael arrived a few minutes later, abandoned his car in the middle of the entrance to the lot, and walked straight to the rear of the ambulance. He didn't say anything to anyone. He simply stood there looking at his mother until he saw her blink twice. The ambulance was taken back. The scan was canceled, and the entire afternoon disappeared into procedures no one cared to remember. Sloane arrived at the parking lot when everything was nearly over, because Raphael had called her the moment he saw the ambulance. She waited outside the security perimeter, and Margot herself came out to bring her in, saying that without Sloane's call, they would have arrived too late. On their way out, Margot stopped at her vehicle to retrieve her coat. She opened the rear door and leaned inside. On the seat was a plastic document box with its lid sprung open, and inside were files standing upright, each with a paper label attached to its spine. Sloane hadn't meant to look, but she was standing at exactly the right angle, and her eyes read the label on the thickest file before she could think to turn away. It didn't bear Gideon Halloran's name. It bore Raphael Halloran's, followed by a string of codes and a smaller line stating that the case had been opened many years earlier. Margot closed the car door. She saw that Sloane had seen it. She didn't pretend otherwise or offer some evasive explanation. She only asked whether Sloane wanted to hear the truth or something that would make her feel better. Sloane said she wanted the truth. Margot leaned back against the side of the vehicle, folded her arms, and said she hadn't come to this city because an elderly woman had lost her voice. She said she had been investigating the Halloran family since before Raphael took his father's place, that she had read every port contract, every union record, every warehouse transfer, and that in all those years, she had never once found a crack wide enough to slip her hand through. She said an organization like that never collapsed from the outside. It collapsed only when the people inside began turning against one another. Then she said the words that sent a chill down Sloane's spine. She said that crack had finally appeared, and its name was Rosalind Halloran. Sloane asked whether she intended to protect the elderly woman. Margot said yes, then added that protection didn't mean locking the door. She explained that if she packed the 9th floor with guards, erected barriers, and controlled every person who came and went, then the person she was trying to find simply wouldn't come at all. They would sit quietly and wait for everything to cool down, and the elderly woman would remain safe until she no longer needed to be kept safe. She said that was why she had kept security around room 908 at the absolute minimum permitted by regulations. One guard at the end of the hallway, a door that wasn't locked from the outside, a visitor list that hadn't been restricted. She said she wanted to see who would walk through that door, and she wanted that person to believe walking through it would be easy. Sloane asked whether she understood that this was precisely why the incident that night had been allowed to happen. Margot fell silent for a moment, then said she did understand, that she had considered that possibility, and that she had still chosen not to change her decision. She said she wasn't a good person. She was a person who got things right, and those two qualities only occasionally belonged to the same person. Then she climbed into her vehicle and drove away. Sloane remained standing in the empty parking lot as the wind swept in from the harbor, and she realized that in this entire story, she no longer knew for certain whose side she was on. The clue came from the very files Sloane had copied before her access card was confiscated. The billing records for all 3 patients contained the same service provider code, and that code led to a registered office in the Northern Warehouse District, a row of prefabricated buildings standing at the foot of a container yard awaiting demolition. Warren said he could obtain an order compelling the release of the documents, but it would take at least 10 business days. Raphael said the original contract wouldn't still be there in 10 days. They went after night had fully fallen. Sloane sat in the passenger seat wearing a dark coat, one hand holding a phone with every notification turned off. During the drive, she had asked herself many times why she was sitting in that car, and the only answer she could find was the image of Walter turning the stopwatch over in his palm and saying that he feared the day people stopped asking for his opinion. The office door wasn't locked because there was nothing left inside worth stealing except paperwork. They found the filing cabinet in the back room, in the second drawer from the bottom, and the contract was exactly where it should have been, roughly 20 pages thick, bearing the signature of a Harrogate representative and that of someone who had signed on behalf of the hospital under a title that didn't exist anywhere in the organizational chart Sloane had once read. Raphael photographed every page before lifting the entire file from the drawer. At that exact moment, the floodlights outside the yard went dark. They didn't all go out at once. The farthest row went first, then the next, then the one after that, each broad stretch of light disappearing at a steady rhythm, as though someone were walking along the breaker panel and switching them off one by one. Raphael turned off the flashlight on his phone. They stood motionless in the darkness, until their eyes slowly adjusted and the containers emerged as black shapes stacked against a moonless sky. A car door closed near the entrance to the yard. Then came footsteps on concrete, unhurried, dividing in 2 directions. They left through the rear door and entered the passage between 2 rows of containers. It was narrow, straight, and seemingly endless, and the sound of their own footsteps echoed from the steel walls on either side as though a third person were walking with them. At the first intersection, Raphael pulled Sloane into the recessed doorway of a container. A flashlight beam swept across the mouth of the passage, stopped, then swept back. The person carrying it didn't call out or say a word. They simply kept walking. That was what frightened Sloane most, the methodical silence of it. They moved on, turned left, then right, and discovered that the row was blocked by 2 containers, stacked tightly against the wall. Behind them, a second beam appeared at the entrance to the passage. Raphael looked up at the chain-link fence running along the edge of the yard, nearly 1.5 times the height of a man, its upper edge lined with coils of rusted barbed wire that had been cut open in one place long ago. He clasped his hands to make a foothold and helped Sloane climb first. She made it to the top, wriggled through the opening, and dropped onto the grass on the other side. Raphael climbed after her. As he swung his body over the top of the fence, a broken strand of barbed wire caught his palm and tore a long gash along his forearm. He didn't make a sound. He dropped beside her, rose to his feet, and they both ran along the dark strip of grass until they reached the car parked 2 blocks away. No one followed them out to the road. Inside the cab, Sloane switched on the overhead light and told him to give her his hand. She took the first aid kit from the glove compartment, cleaned the wound, and began wrapping it. Raphael sat still and let her work, the file still clamped between his knees, and he stared through the windshield for a long while before speaking. He said that back in the yard, at that first intersection, there had been a moment when he knew exactly what he needed to do to end everything that very night. He said he knew whom to call, knew how long it would take them to arrive, and knew that by morning there wouldn't be anyone left walking through that yard. Sloane's hands stopped. He went on, saying that he hadn't made the call, and the reason wasn't fear, but something his mother had told him before he was old enough to drive. She had said that violence was the debt with the highest interest in the world, that borrowing it was easy and took only a few minutes, but people spent their entire lives repaying it and never touched the principal. He said he had argued with her for 20 years, that he used to think those were the words of a woman who didn't have to go out into the streets and do the work herself. Then he fell silent, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. He said that now she was lying there unable to speak, and for the first time in his life, he had realized that the only thing capable of saving her wasn't any of the people he knew how to call, but a stack of papers held between his knees. Sloane tied off the bandage and said nothing. Outside, beyond the row of warehouses, the floodlights came back on one after another, row by row, as though no one had ever turned them off. Curtis Nye sat on a folding chair in the middle of the decommissioned cold storage warehouse, still wearing his coat and glasses, and on an overturned plastic crate in front of him stood a paper cup of water that was already half empty. He had sat down on his own. No one had pushed him. Deacon Rowe stood about 3 paces away. 3 other men lined the wall, and every one of them was waiting. Raphael walked in, pulled over another folding chair, opened it, placed it across from Curtis, and sat down. The first thing he asked was whether Curtis wanted more water. Curtis shook his head. Raphael nodded, then asked how long he had worked at Harrogate. Curtis said almost 4 years. Raphael asked what his title was. Care coordinator, Curtis replied, and even he curled his lip as he said it, because both men knew what that title really meant. Raphael continued, still speaking in the tone of a man confirming an invoice, and asked who had given him the patient lists. Curtis didn't answer. Raphael didn't ask again. He simply sat there looking at him, both hands resting on his knees, the bandage around his right hand stained dark along one edge. There was no sound inside the cold storage warehouse except the wind slipping through the gap beneath the roll-up door. Deacon shifted his weight. One of the men near the wall cleared his throat. Everyone knew what usually happened after a silence like this, and everyone was waiting for a nod. Raphael looked at Curtis for a very long time, long enough that Curtis began twisting his hands together. Then Raphael stood, folded the chair, and said 3 words. "Call the police." No one moved. Deacon asked him to repeat himself, thinking he had misheard. Raphael said it again. "Call the police, and call Agent Tillett too. Give them the address. Tell them exactly where we are and how long this man has been here." One of the men along the wall said that if they did that, the whole group would have a great deal to explain. Raphael said he knew. Deacon stepped closer, lowered his voice, and asked a question that everyone in the warehouse could hear. "If your father were still alive, what would he do?" Raphael stood motionless for a moment, then said his father wouldn't call. He went on to say that was precisely why he had to call now, and if he regretted anything, it was only that this family should have made that call a long time ago. Curtis heard every word, and something inside him gave way. He said he wanted to talk before they arrived. He gave them the name of the person who had signed the contract on the hospital's behalf. He said the patient lists were sent out from the financial counseling office once a week, in the form of asset inventories. He said the person paying him never met with him in person, and only transferred the money through a charitable foundation. And then he gave them the name of the person who ran that foundation. Then he looked up at Raphael and added something no one had asked him to say. "You think your uncle is doing this for the money?" Raphael turned back. Curtis said the houses and land were only things his uncle picked up along the way. That once, after drinking a little too much, the man had told him all of it together wasn't worth what his sister-in-law was keeping, and that all he needed was for her to lose the ability to speak and sign her name, and then it would fall into his hands, along with the guardianship. Curtis said he had asked what it was. His uncle had answered curtly that it was some notebooks. Raphael stood frozen in the middle of the cold storage warehouse. He thought of the moss-green cloth-bound notebook in his coat pocket, of the ribbon his mother had tied around a particular page, of the way every trace of color had drained from Bertrand Gautier's face when he looked down at writing no one could read. Before Raphael could say anything, the phone in his pocket began to vibrate. Warren Ashcroft's name was on the screen. Raphael stepped outside before answering. Warren asked whether he was all right, his voice as concerned as ever. Then he asked whether Raphael was at the cold storage warehouse on the north side, and whether the man his group was holding had said anything yet. Raphael stood outside in the night, with the phone pressed to his ear, looking through the gap beneath the roll-up door at Curtis, who was still sitting on the folding chair beside the paper cup of water, and realized that the call to Agent Tillett hadn't even been made yet. 31 notebooks lay inside a sheet metal box, secured with a combination lock, stored at a self-storage facility near the Beltway, and rented under the name of a woman who had been dead for many years. Raphael opened it using the sequence his mother gave him through the eye-tracking communication device, one digit at a time, and the facility owner standing beside him remarked that the lock probably hadn't been opened in a very long time. The woman chosen to read them was Harriet Vandergraff, 84 years old, a county court stenographer for 39 years before retiring, whose name and telephone number Rosalind herself had written in pencil inside the lid of the box. She arrived by taxi wearing a red wool coat and carrying a magnifying glass and a back cushion, and the first thing she did when she saw the page was sink into the nearest chair. She said it wasn't any standard system of notation. She said the writer had taken the foundation of an old shorthand system and altered more than half of it, changing the connecting strokes, changing the way vowels were marked, and adding private conventions that only the person who invented them could know. She said she would need time, but she could read it. The reading began that afternoon in the small conference room at Warren Ashcroft's office. Warren had asked to remain, but Raphael said he wanted to hear it alone first. Margot Tillett was there, along with Sloane, Harriet, and a recording device placed in the center of the table. Harriet opened the first notebook, raised her magnifying glass, and began to read. From the very first page, every assumption in the room collapsed. There wasn't a single account number in it. There were no ledgers, no streams of money, no company names. There were testimonies, one person at a time, each with a name, an age, an occupation, and the date the account had been recorded. The first was a woman speaking about her husband, a night shift dock worker. The second was a son telling the story of his father. The third was a mother. The fourth was a younger sister. 4 families, 4 men who had gone to work the night shift at a warehouse owned by the Halloran family and never returned home. On the night the warehouse roof collapsed, the official record said it had been an accident caused by the weather. Harriet continued reading, and the pages that followed contained everything no official record had ever documented. Who had told whom that the roof framing had needed to be replaced since the previous season? Who had approved postponing the replacement until the following year? Who had told the night shift foreman to send the men inside and proceed with work as usual? Rosalind had sought out every family, not once, but many times over many years. She had sat in their kitchens, drunk the tea they made for her, listened as they spoke, and recorded everything in a script no one in those rooms could read, including the people whose words she was writing down. She had even recorded the things people said only when they had become too tired to keep holding them inside. Then, in the 19th notebook, Harriet stopped midway through a passage. She lowered her magnifying glass, looked at Raphael, and asked whether he was certain he wanted her to continue. Raphael told her to go on. Harriet read. They were the words of Rosalind's husband, recorded one winter evening many years earlier in their kitchen, after he had been drinking. He said he had known the roof framing needed to be replaced. He said he had chosen the cheaper figure. He said he had lived with it every day, and would live with it until he died. At the bottom of the page, Rosalind had recorded a sentence of her own, the only sentence in the entire notebook written in the first person. She had asked whether he intended to tell anyone, and he had answered no, and she had told him that in that case, she would keep it until someone was strong enough to speak in his place. No one in the room spoke. The recording device was still running. Sloane saw Raphael raise a hand to his face, then lower it again, and she saw Margot Tillett, the woman whose expression hadn't changed once throughout all the days that had passed, quietly switch off the recording. Margot was the one who finally said aloud what everyone had already understood, but no one had dared put into a sentence. She said that until that morning, the person with the strongest reason to make those notebooks disappear had been Gideon Halloran. She said that from this moment forward, He wasn't anymore. She looked directly at Raphael and said that if the elderly woman were declared mentally incompetent, those 31 notebooks would become nothing more than the writings of a woman no longer considered of sound mind. And the only name rescued from everything written on those pages would be his father's, along with everything that bore Raphael's name today. She said he didn't have to do anything at all. He only had to do nothing. That morning, the sky was clear with the rare clarity of late autumn, when the sun hung low and everything seemed edged in gold. Marguerite led Junie across the lawn in the hospital garden. The 6-year-old girl wore a red coat and a wool hat with 2 pom-poms, and she held a drawing folded into quarters against her chest. Marguerite pointed to a window on the 9th floor and told her that she was up there, that her throat was sick and she couldn't speak yet, but she could look down. Junie stood in the middle of the lawn, tilted her face upward, and waved both hands as high as she could. Then she unfolded the drawing and held it up with both hands for her to see. It showed a house, a tree, 3 people standing together, and another person lying in a bed beneath a plaid blanket. Marguerite called the room, switched on the speakerphone, and rested the phone against the girl's shoulder. Junie sang the song her music teacher had taught her the week before. She sang one line wrong in the middle and burst out laughing, then started over and sang it correctly. On the 9th floor, Sloane held the phone close to the head of the bed. Rosalind couldn't make out the words clearly. The sound had grown thin across the distance and through the glass, but she could hear the rhythm, and when she looked down, she saw a tiny red dot bouncing on the grass. When the song ended, Junie shouted that she loved her 3 times, each one louder than the last, then ran after her mother toward the parking lot. Rosalind watched until the red coat disappeared behind the row of maple trees. Raphael arrived early that afternoon. He came in alone, closed the door, and sat in the chair beside the bed. He placed the 19th notebook on his lap, opened it to the page Harriet had read, and left it lying open. He didn't ask his question right away. He sat in silence for a very long time, both hands resting on the cloth cover, and Rosalind waited. At last, he said he had heard everything. He said he had heard the names of those 4 men, had heard the voices of their 4 families spoken again through the mouth of an 84-year-old woman, and had heard what his father had said in their kitchen on that winter night. Then he asked her why. He asked why, for 20 years, she had sat at the same dinner table with him, signed documents beside him, taught him how to judge people and how to read contracts, yet had never spoken a single word about any of it. He said he had lived his entire life with an image of his father hanging inside his mind as something to follow, and she had known perfectly well what that image had been built upon. His voice wasn't loud. It only broke on a few words, and twice he had to stop. Rosalind listened to all of it. Then her eyes moved toward the screen. The small bell began to chime, and this time it was slower than it had ever been before, so slow that Raphael had to lean forward to watch each letter appear. The first 3 words took so long that he could barely endure it. "I am sorry." He read them and said nothing. She continued. The second sentence was much longer, and midway through it, she had to close her eyes and rest. Raphael remained still and waited, one hand tightening around the notebook's cover on his lap. "I waited until you were strong enough to bear the truth." Then came another pause, longer than the one before. "I waited too long." Raphael couldn't speak. He lowered his head, covered his face with both hands, and remained that way for a length of time no one counted. The notebook slipped from his lap and fell to the floor, landing open with its pages face down, and he didn't pick it up. Beyond the window, the late autumn sunlight had withdrawn from the glass and turned the color of lead. The small bell chimed again. Raphael raised his head and looked at the screen through reddened eyes. "You aren't your father." He read the sentence. Then she continued typing, slowly, one word at a time, and it was the longest message she had written since entering the hospital. "I kept those notebooks not to punish him. I kept them because those 4 men had no one left to speak for them." Raphael bent down, picked the notebook up from the floor, brushed off its cover, and placed it back on his lap. He asked her one final question, what she intended to do with them. Rosalind looked at her son for a long time before answering, and when the words appeared, there were only 4 of them. "I'll hand them over." Raphael nodded. He made no promises and said nothing else. He simply remained beside her bed until darkness had fully fallen, and, out in the hallway, the automatic lights came on one by one along the row of closed doors. That first night, before the backup power ran out completely, the eye-tracking device managed to save one more thing that no one ever made public. After Rosalind finished writing her sentence, the machine had begun a new word and registered only a single letter before the screen went dark. One solitary letter, hanging there, leading nowhere. Margot Tillett kept that detail out of every report. Only 4 people knew what the letter was, and Margot had counted those 4 people over and over in her mind. Warren Ashcroft mentioned it for the first time during a strategy meeting in his office, when he said it was fortunate that the machine had managed to save the final letter, because otherwise they would have nothing left to hold on to. No one questioned him. Raphael was bent over the documents, and Sloane was taking notes. Warren mentioned it a second time 3 days later over the phone, when he told Raphael that the other side would challenge the reliability of the device, and that a single isolated letter would be very difficult to explain in court. This time Margot was in the car, listening through the speaker. She said nothing. She merely reached over and turned off the speaker, sat motionless for a long while, then said they needed to move the elderly woman to another room that very night. The plan was assembled within a few hours. Rosalind was moved to the recovery wing on the 4th floor. Her patient bracelet was replaced with one bearing a different name, and her medical records were separated from the central system. The eye-tracking device was connected to its own battery. Beneath the bed, clipped to the iron frame, was a tiny camera that had already been switched on and was transmitting directly outside the building. Margot gave 3 people 3 different pieces of information about the room transfer, and only one of them received the real room number. Then she and Sloane went to sit in the darkened room on the other side of the wall. It was very late when the door opened. Warren Ashcroft entered alone, carrying the leather briefcase worn at the corners, and closed the door very softly behind him. He drew a chair close to the bed and sat down with the manner of a man visiting a client he had represented for many years. He said he was sorry to come so late, but there were too many eyes during the day. He opened his briefcase, took out a prepared statement, placed it on the document stand before her, and explained each paragraph in his familiar, solicitous voice. He said that if she confirmed she couldn't clearly remember what had happened that night, and that the medication might have affected her awareness, then every accusation against the nurse would be dismissed within the week. The case before the licensing board would be withdrawn, and she could return to work. He said he knew Rosalind cared about her. He said that sometimes saving one person was enough. Rosalind looked at him and didn't type anything. Warren waited, then sighed and said he understood why she was silent, but she should know that he was only a man caught in the middle. Then he began to talk, and once he started, he couldn't stop. He told her through whose hands the patient lists had passed when they left the financial counseling office, whose account had been used to turn the hallway camera away, which device on the trusted list had been used to sign the second petition, and who had kept that device ever since her husband was alive. He said the medication cabinet code had been nothing more than a minor matter intended to keep the nurse occupied for a while. Then his voice changed, turning more bitter as he began to speak about Gideon. He said people kept assuming Gideon had done it for money, but Warren knew better, because he had sat beside the man for 20 years in rooms where Gideon was never allowed to sit at the head of the table. He said that on the night the warehouse roof collapsed, the man who had stepped forward and accepted responsibility before the inspectors, the man who had signed the official report, the man who had gone to prison for 4 years, had been Gideon, not his older brother. He said that when Gideon came out of prison, the family had prepared everything for him: the presidency of a charitable foundation, a respectable name in the newspapers, and a silver ring engraved with an anchor identical to his brother's, except that no one had ever pulled out a chair and invited Gideon to sit down. Warren said those 4 years had never been given back, that Gideon had spent 20 years tapping that ring against tabletops as he waited for his turn, and that when he finally understood his turn would never come, he decided to take it for himself. Then Warren stopped, lifted his eyes, and realized that Rosalind hadn't looked at the statement even once. She was staring directly at him. Warren slowly turned his head toward the foot of the bed, and there, close against the edge of the iron frame, a tiny red light was glowing steadily in the darkness. Warren Ashcroft was taken away that very night, and by morning the court had scheduled the guardianship hearing for 2 days later, sooner than anyone had expected, because the other side understood as well that time had changed sides. All 31 notebooks had to be brought to court together with Harriet Vandergraaf's certified translations, and Margot Tillett decided to transport them by road that morning in 3 unmarked vehicles, with no sirens. The notebooks were packed inside 2 sealed sheet metal boxes and placed in the middle vehicle. Raphael rode in the first. Harriet sat in the last with her back cushion and her magnifying glass tucked inside the pocket of her red wool coat. Sloane rode beside her. The route to the federal courthouse passed through the old neighborhood at the foot of the hill, where patches of cobblestone remained from the days when the harbor was still bustling, along a narrow street, barely wide enough for 2 lanes of traffic, with nowhere to turn off for almost a mile. When the convoy reached the head of the street, it had to stop. 3 small trucks were parked across the road with their hoods raised, as though cargo were being unloaded, and around 10 men stood scattered on either side of them. No one held anything in his hands. No one said a word. They simply stood there, and the way they stood made it clear that they had no intention of going anywhere for a very long time. Margot stepped out. The nearest man told her that work was underway in the area, that the road was temporarily impassable, and that he didn't know when it would reopen. He spoke in the polite voice of a man who had memorized the line. Margot told him she was a federal agent, carrying out a court order. He said he was very sorry. Behind the convoy, a black sedan approached and stopped several dozen yards away, its engine still running. No one inside got out. The rear windows were dark, but through a gap lowered by about a handspan, one side of a pair of tortoise-shell glasses could be seen. Raphael stood beside the first vehicle and looked toward the sedan. He knew who was inside. He also knew that if this lasted too long, the court would postpone the hearing, and at this stage, a single postponement would be enough for everything to begin slipping away. He raised a hand and turned the ring on his little finger once, remembering the intersection in the container yard that night, remembering that he knew whom to call and how long it would take them to arrive. He didn't call. He merely stood there. Then came the sound of footsteps from the other end of the street. At first there were 2 men, then 4. Then more emerged from the side alleys, from the doorway of the corner cafe, and from the steps of the old brick buildings. They were elderly men, gray-haired or bald, wearing work coats worn thin at the shoulders and heavy-soled shoes. Some leaned on canes. Others walked slowly because their hips hurt. They moved into the middle of the road directly in front of the 3 small trucks and stopped in a line that stretched across the entire width of the street. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them stepped closer to anyone else. They simply stood with their arms hanging at their sides, their faces turned toward the black sedan at the far end of the street. Sloane counted 20 men. Raphael recognized several of them. Men who had worked the night shift at the North Docks in his father's time. Men he remembered only vaguely, and he realized that the 4 names Harriet had read in that conference room all belonged to men who had brothers, friends from the job, and men who had worked beside them on the same shift, and every one of those people was standing here now. One of them, a tall, thin man near the end of the line, turned to look at Raphael and gave him the faintest nod. Then he faced forward again. The man standing beside the trucks watched the line for a moment, pulled out his phone, walked a few paces away, and spoke to someone. When he returned, he told Margot that the work appeared to have finished sooner than expected, then began signaling for the drivers to back their trucks against the curb. The entire exchange unfolded in silence. No one touched anyone. No one raised his voice. The only sounds on the street were idling engines and the wind blowing uphill from the water. At the far end of the street, the black sedan reversed, turned around in a narrow courtyard, and drove away. The line of men remained in place until all 3 vehicles in the convoy had passed. As the final vehicle drew alongside them, Harriet Vandergraff lowered her window and lifted a hand. Several men in the line raised their hands in return. Then they dispersed slowly, each heading in his own direction, as though they had just finished a shift. The courtroom on the 3rd floor of the federal courthouse had high ceilings and tall windows, and that morning the light fell diagonally across the clerk's desk in a white band. Judge Frances Kirkland took her seat, looked over the list of those present, then said she would begin by doing something she very rarely did. She said she would question the respondent herself, that none of those questions had been provided to either side in advance, and that she required everyone to remain silent until each answer was complete. Rosalind sat in a wheelchair beside the witness table, the eye-tracking device mounted on a stand before her, its screen turned toward the court clerk. The first question was very simple. The judge asked her name. The entire courtroom waited. The small bell chimed 1 note at a time, slowly, and in the silence between those chimes, everyone could clearly hear the ceiling fan and the sound of someone shifting a foot beneath a chair. The petitioner's attorney stirred as though he meant to say something, then stopped. He couldn't interrupt a woman while she was spelling her own name, because interrupting her at that moment would mean doing exactly what his clients were trying to prove she was no longer capable of doing. She completed her answer. The judge then asked whether she knew why she was there. She answered, The judge asked who had filed the petition seeking guardianship over her, and Rosalind spelled out both names, her brother-in-law's and her son's, without missing a single letter. Then the judge asked a question no one had anticipated. She said there was a line in the petition describing Rosalind's condition and asked whether she could repeat it. Rosalind spelled out each word, more slowly than she had before. The respondent is no longer capable of speech. Then she typed another sentence no one had asked for. The date stamp predates my fall. The courtroom remained silent long enough that the judge had to tap one finger lightly against the bench before continuing. Harriet Vandergraff was called next. She placed her back cushion on the chair, took out her magnifying glass, and received permission from the court to read directly from the originals while the certified translations were examined alongside them. She read in the voice of a woman who had spent nearly 40 years seated at a court clerk's desk. Steady, clear, without emphasis or ornament. And that was precisely what gave the words their weight. She read the 4 names. She read each man's age, occupation, and work shift. She read the words of the wife, the son, the mother, and the younger sister. It was the first time in all those years that the 4 names had been spoken aloud in an official room, entered into the record, and assigned page numbers. In the back row, Raphael sat with his spine straight and didn't move. Then Harriet opened the 19th notebook. She told the court that the passage she was about to read had been recorded in the respondent's home and that the speaker was Rosalind's late husband. Then she read. She read the sentence about the roof framing that had needed replacement since the previous season. She read the sentence about the cheaper figure. She read the sentence in which the man said he would live with what he had done until the day he died. And as she read, Gideon Halloran sat at the opposite table wearing his tortoiseshell glasses, a silk handkerchief folded neatly in his breast pocket, listening to his brother's voice return through the very script he had mocked for 20 years. The script he had once dismissed as the pastime of a housewife who used to work at the courthouse. He didn't move. Only his right hand, resting on the table, began tapping his ring lightly against the wood, once, then once again, until his attorney reached over and stopped him. When Harriet finished, the judge asked whether Rosalind wished to say anything before the court issued its ruling. The small bell began to chime again, and this time the entire courtroom sat in silence through the longest wait of that morning. The words appeared in fragments on the screen projected onto the courtroom wall. I haven't lost my mind. A pause. I've only lost my voice. Another pause, longer than the first. Those aren't the same thing, and you deliberately pretended they were. Judge Kirkland read the statement aloud for the record, then dismissed the guardianship petition in its entirety, declared the respondent legally competent, and referred the case file to prosecutors. Gideon Halloran was escorted out through the side aisle. As he passed the wheelchair, he stopped. No one spoke. Rosalind didn't touch the eye-tracking device. She didn't write a single word. She merely raised her head and looked at him with the calm gaze of a woman who had spent nearly her entire life sitting and taking notes in rooms just like this one. Gideon held her gaze for a few seconds. Then he looked down at the floor and allowed the 2 people beside him to lead him away. Harrogate ceased operating before anyone even had time to file dissolution papers. The county court reviewed every guardianship petition the company had ever filed under its name, and the final count was 47. 47 people, most of them over 70, each with a file of documents, and each file containing language almost identical to the others. Every case had to be reopened one by one, and the work continued throughout the winter. Some had died before their files were brought back out, and the court sent notices to their children and grandchildren. Some no longer had homes to be returned to them, because the properties had changed hands twice, and the final buyers had purchased them in good faith. Some received only compensation, and a document stating that the previous ruling had been vacated. But all 47 people received the same thing. A line entered into the court record stating that the respondent had never been declared legally incapacitated. Sloane read the list at her kitchen table one evening, and she sat for a very long time over the line bearing the name Corinne Ashby, the high school music teacher she had never met, the woman who had died that autumn. Raphael signed his name in the state business registry on a Tuesday morning. There were no reporters, no one taking photographs, only Raphael, a different attorney now that Warren was gone, and a filing clerk seated behind a glass partition. He submitted a complete disclosure of the ownership structure for the family's entire network of warehouses and docks. Every subsidiary, every person whose name appeared on the documents, every ownership stake, including the interest that no one had ever put on paper in 3 generations. He knew exactly what would happen next. From the moment those papers entered the system, Anyone could search for them, any agency could follow the trail, and every agreement that had ever been preserved through spoken promises and habit would have to live or die in the light. Deacon Rowe had asked him 3 times during the previous week whether he was certain. On the final night, Deacon said his father would have called it the act of a man turning himself in. Raphael said he knew. He said he had held the pen for 20 minutes at his desk without being able to sign, and that nothing he had ever done in his life had frightened him as much as this, not even that night in the container yard. Then he added that his mother had kept 31 notebooks in a sheet metal box for 20 years, simply because 4 men had no one left to speak for them. And if she could do that, he could sign 1 piece of paper. That Tuesday morning, he signed, and when he stepped out of the building, a light rain was falling. He stood beneath the awning and waited for it to ease, just like anyone else. Walter Pruitt's houseboat was moored at the east dock, a small boat with a faded blue-painted metal roof, berthed in the 7th slip from the head of the pier, where he had paid his docking fees faithfully throughout 31 years at the machine shop, and for more than a decade after his retirement. The guardianship order had already transferred control of his property to a third party, and the documents for the sale of the houseboat had been prepared. They lacked only the final signature when everything fell apart. On the day the court vacated the ruling, Sloane drove him to the dock. He didn't say a word throughout the journey. When they arrived, he made his own way along the pier with his cane, slowly, stopping twice to catch his breath, while Sloane walked behind him without offering her arm because he had told her not to. He stood before the houseboat for a long while, looking at the blue metal roof and the worn mooring lines. Then, he opened the cover of the brass stopwatch in his coat pocket and looked down at its scratched glass face. He said he didn't need it to know the time. He only needed it to know that he was still the timekeeper. Then he stepped onto the deck, unlocked the door, and went inside. Sloane remained at the head of the pier. A little while later, she heard the radio come on inside, an afternoon tide forecast, and the announcer's voice reading each number one by one, steady and measured, against the sound of water lapping against the wooden hull. The Patient Communication Center opened on an early spring morning in a renovated 2-story building near the harbor, where light reflected off the water and cast slow ripples across the lobby ceiling. The program was very simple. Any hospital in the state that needed assistive communication equipment for a patient who couldn't speak could borrow it free of charge, along with someone to install it and provide instruction. A sentence was posted against a white background on every office door in the center. Talk to the patient. Don't talk about the patient. Sloane Merrick's professional license was fully reinstated by the licensing board at the end of winter, and she accepted the position of directing the program instead of returning to the night shift. Walter Pruitt arrived half an hour before his appointment, wearing a dark blue sweater with patches at the elbows and making his way into the lobby with a cane. He handed Sloane a small wooden box. Inside was the brass stopwatch. He said he had kept time for other people all his life, and now he wanted it to remain in a place where people kept time for those who needed others to wait for them. It was placed in a glass display case in the lobby, beside a card bearing his name and noting his 31 years at the ferry terminal machine shop. Junie cut the ceremonial ribbon with a pair of scissors larger than both her hands put together, and her mother had to steady her from behind. When the ribbon finally parted, the entire lobby erupted in laughter and applause, and the little girl turned to find Rosalind in the crowd before throwing both hands into the air. Rosalind Halloran sat in the front row in her wheelchair. Her voice had partially returned, but it was hoarse and broken, and she could speak only a few sentences at a time before she had to rest. She stood and delivered 3 sentences, thanking everyone for coming, thanking the people who had stood shoulder to shoulder across the sloping street that day, and saying that this place didn't belong to her. Then she sat down and let the eye-tracking device say the rest. The words appeared slowly on the large screen behind the platform, and the entire lobby waited in silence until the message was complete. They thought taking away a person's voice meant taking away the person. A pause. They got the order wrong. That same week, in the visiting room of the federal prison, Gideon Halloran received an envelope with no sender's name. Inside was a sheet of paper handwritten in the small, curved symbols he had mocked for 20 years, with a typed translation on the back. The translation contained only 2 lines. "Your brother's name is in this notebook too. You aren't the only one who must pay." He read it over and over for a long time, then folded the paper along its original creases and slipped it into his coat pocket. Late on the afternoon of the opening ceremony, Raphael Halloran sat in the waiting area outside the lobby with 2 paper cups of coffee resting on his lap, one for himself and another that had already begun to grow cold. He didn't send a message. He didn't call. He simply sat there until Sloane emerged, carrying a stack of files in her arms, her hair tied back in haste. She looked at the 2 cups of coffee, then at him, then sat in the chair beside him and took her cup. Neither of them spoke for a long while. Inside the office, Rosalind called Sloane back, placed a brand new blank notebook and a pen in front of her, then took her hand and guided it through a single stroke, a small curve with a hook at the end. Sloane asked what it meant. Rosalind wrote the answer beside it in ordinary handwriting, a single word: listen. This story leaves us with one very simple truth, that a person's dignity doesn't depend on whether they can still speak, but on whether someone is willing to sit down at eye level and wait for them to finish what they have to say. Someone's voice may be taken from them, but no one can take away their ability, their memory, or their self-respect unless we stop listening. And sometimes, the kindest thing any of us can do for our parents, for the elderly people in our neighborhood, or for a patient lying motionless in a hospital bed, is simply to ask what they want before deciding for them. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so you can hear more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Which part moved you most deeply? We would love to read the thoughts that come from the depths of your heart in the comments. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.